Hello class, and we're going to take a look now at chapter 17, Wage Determination. And this is our second to last chapter for the course. And we're going to look at how wages are determined in competitive markets and imperfectly competitive ones, and the various factors which can impact them, including labor unions. So we're going to look at labor, wages, and earnings, what we mean by a purely competitive labor market, the monopsony model, 3 different union models, bilateral monopoly model, what is the controversy surrounding minimum wage laws in economics, wage differentials, and finally, what do we mean by pay for performance? So what are wages? And we've touched on this already, but wages are the prices paid for labor. You definitely covered this in 1001, and wages are the price you pay for labor. Just like everything when running a business has a cost, your employees' cost are their wages. What do you pay out in your salaries? And it can be any kind of worker. It can be anyone from someone behind the counter to an executive at your corporation. Wages is all of the pay towards the employees of a company. And nominal wages are the amount of money that we receive in an hour, day, or year. Your wages can be quoted many different ways. You can be quoted what do you make by hour, or your yearly salary, or anything like that. And real wages are what can you actually buy with them. That's your purchasing power. And they can vary greatly among nations, regions, jobs, and individuals. So if we look at the following slide here, this is as of 2020. What the average hourly pay is in various countries around the world. Germany about $55, Italy about $45, the United States about $42, then the UK, Canada, South Korea. Going down the list, this is just differences in hourly wages. The United States is quite high in comparison, but in industrialized nations, demand for labor is relatively large compared to the supply. So in industrialized nations such as Japan or South Korea or the UK or the US, there's generally a high demand for labor compared to the supply. Just like any product, if there is a large amount of people that want jobs, and not very many jobs, you're going to have to pay more in a relative sense. If there are a tremendous amount of jobs that no one can fill, wages can be fairly cheap. So, same thing, if there is large demand for labor, wages will be higher. So what about productivity? Demand for labor, like other resources, depends on its productivity. And the greater the productivity of labor, the greater the demand for it. Supply is relatively fixed. Obviously, populations of countries do change. People get born, people immigrate or emigrate, and things like that come and go. But in a fairly short amount of time, the supply of labor stays pretty stable. So, as a consequence, the greater the productivity of labor, the greater the demand for it. And if labor is relatively fixed in supply, wages will go up. The US and other advanced economies benefit from highly productive labor due to lots of capital goods we have, advanced technology, natural resources, the quality of the labor, so training, college degrees, professional certifications, and other less obvious factors such as a social and political environment that emphasizes production and productivity. Once again, the social environment of a country does actually have an impact on how productive its labor force will be. Does it emphasize things like production, productivity, successful companies, stuff like that? Generally, that will lead to a more productive labor force. So output per hour and real hourly compensation in the U.S. As we look from 1970 to now, hourly compensation was quite a bit outstripping output per hour. Output per hour, however, has gone up, and hourly compensation, while it's gone up, is now no longer outstripping it. They're very close together, and that's this portion right here. You could make some arguments to this. You can make arguments that hourly pay is not kept up with the times, even though it's gone up in a real sense, it hasn't. And you can also make the argument that people are simply more productive per hour of work due to all of the technologies which did not exist in 1970. In 1970, we didn't have emails, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have automated factory equipment, and all of the things we take for granted, smartphones, programs such as Excel to do your math instead of having to use a pen and paper to go through data and make calculations. We've improved productivity massively in a technological sense since 1970. So as a consequence, that could be argued as well why we've become so much more productive. The trend of real wages in the United States, what we're looking at here, productivity of labor has increased substantially, as I just said, over the long run, causing the demand for labor to shift rightwards more rapidly than increases in supply. So wages have been going up. And this figure demonstrates the trend in supply and demand of labor since 1900. So even though supply has gone up, it is not going up as much as the demand for labor. And as a consequence, wages are trending upwards. So in a purely competitive labor market, meaning that you have pure competition, jobs have to vie for their employees. What is the market demand for labor? It's the sum of all firm demand, or the sum of all demand for jobs across the board in a sector we're interested in. So let's say carpenters. If we want to know the demand for carpenters, we would look at every possible job opening or job for carpenters, and that would be the sum of firm demand. And the market supply for labor, it's upward sloping because there's competition among industries. If you're a carpenter now, it doesn't mean you have to be a carpenter forever. You can retrain and do something else. If you're good with working with wood in your hands, it would probably be fairly easy to retrain to maybe be something like a metal worker, or work with stone, or install tile, or something broadly similar to carpentry where you're using power tools and you're building things, but you may not necessarily be working with wood. So there is competition among industries. Or you could retrain and go back to school and do something completely different. But regardless, you do not have to stay in one industry, so the supply has an upward sloping curve. And what is labor market equilibrium? Well, labor market equilibrium is defined by the intersection of your market labor demand curve and the market labor supply curve. So just like any other thing we've looked at that's achieved equilibrium, it's the intersection of supply and demand. And we can take a look right here. So these graphs demonstrate the labor supply and labor demand in a purely competitive market and a single competitive firm. In the individual firm, the labor supply curve is represented by a horizontal line because it is perfectly elastic. The labor demand curve for the individual firm is downward sloping, reflecting the fact that to attract more workers, they must pay more. And they'll generally maximize profits by hiring workers up to the point where MRP is equal to MRC. MRP is equal to MRC. And that's what we're looking at here. The overall market, it's the intersection of your supply and demand curves. So if we look here, marginal resource cost, that's MRC. Let's take a look. Each firm will maximize its profit by hiring this type of labor up to the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal resource cost. When an individual competitive firm faces the market price for a resource, the marginal cost is constant and equal to the market price for each and every unit that the competitive firm may choose to purchase. In this example, MRC is constant at $20 and matches the $20 wage rate. Thus, the firm is in a purely competitive market, and it's maximizing its profit by hiring workers up to the point where the wage rate equals MRP. And that's what we're doing right here. We're hiring workers up to the point where the wage rate equals MRP. So what is a monopsony? Not a monopoly, but a monopsony. In a monopsony, there's only one buyer for labor. So this can be situations where there is only one job that fit people with a specific skill set. The workers who provide this type of labor are needed, but they have few employment options other than working for the monopsony, because maybe they're geographically immobile or their skills aren't transferable to other jobs. And this makes the firm a wage maker, meaning the wage rate they pay varies directly with the number of workers available. In this case, the firm's labor supply curve will be upward sloping, and the MRC will be higher than the wage rate. To maximize profit, the monopsonist will employ the quantity of labor at which MRC and MRP are equal. So a monopsony is when, if there's one game in town for someone with a specific skill set, and labor may be immobile or lacking skills, so you may just have some employees that have one specific skill set that it would be too much of a barrier for them to retrain, or there's only one job in town and they can't really move. That would be examples of a monopsony. Or they have a skill set so specialized there's really only one organization they can work with. So in that case, it's not pure competition. You can't just simply go to other jobs or other industries. So if we look here, the upsloping labor supply curve is shown. MRC, the labor supply curve of the monopsonist, lies above the labor supply curve of the competitive market, or S. The monopsonist will hire quantity M workers and only pay a wage rate of WM compared to the market wage rate of WC. So this is the original market wage rate where MRP intersects the supply curve. But in this case, as this is a monopsony, they're paying less than the truly competitive wage rate because they are the only game in town. So they're going to hire more than the competitive market would. Point A is the competitive market, point B is the monopsony, but they're only going to pay point C instead of point A once again. So there is a difference between what they're paying and what they're hiring. It's not the true intersection of the curves. The reason being because there's only one game in town. So if we look here, note the increasing MRC due to the need to pay more to attract additional workers from other areas. Again, the monopsonist will employ the quantity of labor at the point where MRC and MRP are equal. So at the point where MRC and MRP are equal, that's where they will hire up to. So the cost, it's not a market rate. They have to go up more and more and more. Marginal cost, or the change in hiring an additional human or group of people or whatever we're looking at, it's going up. It's not flat like the previous one because this isn't being determined by the market. They have to increase their pay to bring in additional workers than they already have. However, once again, they'll employ the quantity of labor at the point where MRC and MRP are equal. So, monopsony power, what do we have? They can maximize profits by hiring smaller number of workers. So a monopsonist will maximize profits by employing a smaller number of workers and paying a lower wage than the competitive market. Society will get a smaller output, and workers will receive a wage rate that is less than their marginal revenue product. While monopsonistic labor markets are uncommon in the United States, there are a few examples. Nurses are a good example in the real world. In the medical area, nurses are typically limited in their choice of employers to the relatively small number of hospitals that may be in their area. Professional athletes, when they're drafted, we're not talking about free agency, we're just talking about when they're drafted and go into the pros. They're limited through their draft to specific employers only. The team who drafts you, you have to work for, barring some weird circumstances if they choose to trade you or something like that. But they have the power over you in the beginning and can pay you generally a lot less than what a free agent gets once they no longer are under a rookie contract or something like that. When you become a free agent, that's the market rate. All the teams, if you're a baseball player, are bidding for you. Whereas when you get drafted, you're generally under some pretty fixed guidelines for that initial contract. So that would be an example of a monopsony as well. Not professional sports in general, when athletes are first drafted. Football, baseball, all of the major sports work broadly similar there. So in some situations, labor market workers unionize and create their own monopsonistic power. We're going to look at that in a bit. What is a union? A union is when a group of workers come together and engage in what is known as collective bargaining, or they speak on behalf of all of themselves with the power of a group. You may have seen recently the United Auto Workers, Car Workers Union were on strike and just came to new, very favorable for them contracts with the major automakers. That's an example of collective bargaining. The TV and film writers' strike recently that just got resolved was one, as was the strike from the Screen Actors Guild. That was one as well. So what is one thing unions can do? Unions seek to increase the demand for labor. So the demand enhancement model is the first of 3 union models examined in this chapter. So unions can increase the demand for their labor by increasing the demand for the goods and services they help produce. This could be accomplished in many ways. A lot of unions engage in what are called political lobbying. They lobby the government or support government policies to either input prices or the price of complementary resources, or they may lobby the government to make a product essential or subsidized or anything like that. So if they succeed, what do they wind up doing? They increase the demand in society for this product, and as a consequence increase the demand for union labor. This will create a higher union wage along with more jobs. So a lot of times unions love to argue on behalf of whatever they're doing, and they like to lobby governmental officials to get said governmental officials to pass laws that are favorable to whatever field they are operating in or whatever products they are making. By doing that, it increases demand, and that would increase supply of labor as well. More demand for products, more workers would have to get hired, and wages should go up as well. So that's one thing unions try to do. They try to increase demand for whatever field they are working in, be it a product or a service. But a second union model is now what is known as the craft union model. So what is the craft union model? So the craft union model, some unions attempt to restrict the supply of labor available. So they're going to prevent people from entering a job and thus affect the wage rate paid as well. Labor unions have supported legislation that has in the past restricted immigration. If you restrict immigration, less people are coming into a country, there are less people to hire. Immigrants also are more often willing than not to take jobs at lower rates than people already living in a country. So if you restrict it, in theory, you can increase the wages being paid to the union members. They've done things like reduce child labor. That's undoubtedly a plus. In the past, many years ago, in the Charles Dickens era, a lot of companies would hire child labor and be incredibly unscrupulous. The goal being you could pay children a lot less than you could pay adults. Obviously, child labor is now highly illegal. Children under 18 can work in certain circumstances, but it's restricted, and their parents have to sign off on it and all of that. Whereas out-and-out child labor has long been banned. Craft unions also may do things like this: encourage compulsory retirement. What's an example of this? Airline pilots. Airline pilots generally have to retire fully from commercial service by the age of 65. They are unionized. Obviously, there are some very good reasons why. Very elderly pilots often won't have the reflexes anymore or anything like that, but that's an example of a compulsory retirement. Once a pilot hits 65 years old, they have to retire from flying commercial planes. Enforce a shorter work week. If you enforce a shorter work week, union members, let's say, can only work 5 days during the week or set hours. That's going to cap the amount of productivity as well, and companies can't continue hiring additional people or forcing them to work more hours, so their real pay is going to be higher. They're working less hours at the same pay or something like that. So craft unions also maintain restrictive membership policies. So a lot of unions you have to join, and if you don't get in the union, you can't work. And they generally will force employers to agree to hire only craft union members. Ones that don't, if you've ever seen a union protest or something, they'll try to shame employers that refuse to hire union workers. So major films, for example, have to hire members of the Screen Actors Guild. That's a craft union. And if you're not a member of one, you can't work on most major films. So as a consequence, when the Screen Actors Guild was on strike recently, no movies were being made. So in this case, what have they done? A similar situation exists in many professional occupations which push for legislation requiring occupational licensing. So they may not have a firm union, but an occupational license works the same way. You're a licensed plumber, you're a licensed electrician, you're a licensed pilot. You have to go through many, many hours of classroom teaching, certifications, whatever you're doing to get an official license. If you don't have that license, you cannot legally operate in that field. So as a consequence, it once again restricts the supply of labor. So you can't just say, I'm a plumber, and go start installing toilets and sinks in people's houses without a license. I mean, you can, but you can get arrested by doing that. So as a consequence, any form of occupational license is going to limit the amount of people in a field, and that will restrict the labor supply and increase wages. So exclusive or craft unionism, we have the supply curve pulling in. As the supply curve is pulling in, it's riding up higher on the demand curve. Quantity of labor goes down, wages go up. Remember, when you have less supply, quantity goes down, price goes up. And that's exactly what we're looking at right here. So that's exclusive or craft unionism. You could have the opposite, inclusive or industrial unionism. And this is going to be the third model we look at. These are unions that seek to organize all available workers, so workers that are in the field but are not a member of a union. I used the United Auto Workers as an example before because they're going to show up here again. Not all people who build cars are in the United Auto Workers. A lot of plants across the United States, Tesla is a good example, uses non-union employees. So those organizations, those unions, the UAW, wants to try to get those non-union employees to join them. And this is what's called an inclusive or industrial union. So they seek to organize all available workers rather than just a select few like the previous one we were looking at, like pilots. Industrial unions seek all available unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled workers in the industry. By including such a large number, they can put a company under great pressure to agree to its wage demands because it has the right to strike. What's a strike? A strike is when the union tells its employees don't come to work, shut the plants down, and it's a way to inflict leverage on the company that hires them to agree to their demands to end the strike. By agreeing to a union's wage demands, the firm becomes a wage taker, the labor supply becomes perfectly elastic, creating a higher wage rate, but again, reducing the number of workers employed. So that's what we're looking at here. So industrial unions, really large ones, have a lot of power over companies to get them to agree to their labor demands because they control everybody, not just one part of their employees. And if they succeed in going on strike, like we just saw with the car companies, they can shut the entire company down until the strike ends. The company now has no one to build cars or do really anything else with their day-to-day operations. So are unions successful? This is something that can be debated until the end of time, and not something we have the time to cover to a huge degree in this class. But are unions successful? You can make arguments either way. You can say that wages are 15% higher on average with union employees versus non-union ones. But both exclusive and inclusive unionism tends to reduce employment in unionized firms. So you can argue also that unions lead to higher unemployment and also restrict ability to demand higher wages. And what do we mean by this? If there's a decline in employment, the union keeps arguing for higher wages and the company's hiring less people, because unions can't force a company to hire people. They can negotiate for their current members. It has the effect of restricting the ability of the union to demand higher wages eventually. Unions can demand all they want, but if they demand too much, workers could lose their jobs. Companies may shut a factory down. They may not be able to afford wages up to a certain point, or the company may fail. So you could demand wages as high as you want, but in practice, workers may balk against wage rate requests. They may fight their union membership if those requests are so high or unreasonable that a lot of workers may be laid off. They might get that wage because what's the alternative? The alternative is the company has no employees, they're on strike. And when companies have a strike, there really isn't a very good way to rectify that. If you do take any labor relations classes, you'll go into it more. You can hire temporary employees, but that leads to all sorts of problems as well. So if the company agrees to these new larger wages, but as a consequence of agreeing lays off half the workforce, that's obviously not in the best interest of most of the workers. Most workers would rather have a job than a raise, if torn between the two. So what's a bilateral monopoly? A bilateral monopoly occurs when there's a strong industrial union in a monopsonist labor market. In this case, you have both a single buyer and seller of labor, and the effect on wage rate is indeterminate since it will depend on which party has the greater bargaining power. Back to professional sports, all the players have a union. Football has the Players Association, same with baseball. So rookie contracts is a monopsony. They have a union backing them. What's the effect on the wage rate? Well, they constantly are bargaining with each other. Every time the union contracts get re-ratified in professional sports, rookie deals and all of that are always in the negotiations. Salary cap is always in the negotiations. So that's an example of when you have a monopsony confronted with a union. It's not uncommon, but there's an indeterminate outcome. Who's better at the negotiations? Is the professional league or the union better? And we have had examples of both. We've had certainly plenty of strikes over the years in professional sports, in addition to various compromises and deals made between the two sides. So there's no determinate outcome because it is subjective. So that's what we're looking at here in the graph of the bilateral monopoly labor market. We can see the different forces at work. Which force wins out cannot be predicted by economic theory. It's once again subjective. This situation may be more desirable as the most likely outcome is a higher wage rate than under pure competition, but more workers are employed than under monopsonistic competitions. So once again, it's indeterminate what one has more power, the organization or the union, and it is subjective. That's what we're looking at in this chart right here. So what about minimum wage? And this is going to be the last topic we look at in this chapter. And why would there ever be a case for or against minimum wage? At first glance, you would say that a good minimum wage, a high minimum wage, is something that should be necessary, and you could certainly make arguments there. There is a federal minimum wage. As of 2009, it was $7.25 an hour. I believe it's slightly higher now, but that doesn't get changed very much. Most minimum wages that we run into are the state and locally set ones. The New York State one is, I believe, approaching $15 an hour. New York City is. New York State, I believe, is going that way. So most minimum wages aren't the federal one. The federal one only applies to limited places that don't have their own minimum wage. Most major states do. But a minimum wage is once again, version of a price floor. You can't go below the price floor. Minimum wage of $15 an hour means we cannot legally hire someone for less than that. And that minimum wage may be above the market rate. So the United States has had a federal minimum wage since 1938, and a lot of states have laws of their own that could be significantly higher than the federal rate. Critics argue that the minimum wage, if it's above the equilibrium wage rate, which I just said, can cause employees to hire fewer workers, or may even cause people to get fired or firms to go out of business because they can't pay it. And they could argue that many of the workers who receive the minimum wage, such as teenagers, aren't really living in impoverished households and aren't self-supporting. A teenager who's working a couple shifts a week at McDonald's for some extra spending money is probably not a head of the household and may not need a guaranteed minimum. The flip side of the coin here, the case for, would argue in many low-pay labor markets, employers exercise monopsonistic power, and thus a required minimum wage can increase wage rates without causing significant unemployment. This is very subjective. You could argue this until the end of time. There is no clear answer to what view is correct. On one hand, the employment and unemployment effects of minimum wage do not appear to be as great as many critics fear. But on the other hand, minimum wage is not as strong an anti-poverty tool as supporters contend that a large part of its effect is dissipated on non-poverty families. The other issue with minimum wage is anytime wages get raised, it also leads to inflation, and that could eat into some of the well-intended consequences of that higher minimum wage. So once again, this is something that could be argued far outside of the bounds of this class. And here is just a selection of annual wages in selected occupations, going from anesthesiologists, which are a type of doctor, average annual wages of over $250,000, fast food cooks at the bottom, about $24,000, and all sorts of different things in between. This is as of 2020. These numbers will be a little higher now due to all of the inflation we've seen, but this is just a selection of various jobs, just a selection of various jobs down the line here. So the wage differential between labor markets A and B above results solely from differences in labor demand. In labor markets C and D, differences in labor supply are the causes. So in labor markets C and D, we have the same demand but different supply. So D has lower wages than C because there's a much greater supply. And A and B, the wages are different. A is a much higher wage than B because the demand is much higher in A than B. So that's just differences. There is no one-size-fits-all labor market. So wage differences across occupations, and these are the differences created across occupations and what explains them. So even across one occupation, you can have differentials or differences in pay. A surgeon just starting out would make a lot less than one who has years of experience and is famous, for instance. So if we focus on the effect of labor demand on the wage differential, we can see that the strength of labor demand varies greatly among occupations due to differences in how much occupational groups contribute to the revenue of their respective employers. The marginal revenue productivity for these types of workers is high. We can see this illustrated in the demand for professional athletes. On the supply side, workers differ greatly in their skill sets as well as their mental and physical characteristics and education and training. In some groups, there may be fewer qualified workers than others, leading to higher wages for those limited workers. What is human capital? Human capital is the accumulation of outcomes of prior investments in education, training, and other factors that increase productivity and earnings. Compensating differences are wages that must be paid to compensate for non-monetary differences in various jobs. So if you went from a job where you were working remote and didn't have to commute to now one where you have to spend money to commute by train or car, you may expect a higher wage as a compensating difference. That's an example there. Undesirable jobs must pay higher wages to recruit workers who could easily qualify for less demanding positions. Why would you want to work in a job that's really stressful or something that's really undesirable? Generally, the difference is higher pay. If that job didn't have higher pay, you would not choose to work in that job. So education levels, weekly earnings, and the unemployment rate. So generally, the higher levels of degrees, professional degrees, master degrees, generally have lower unemployment than bachelor's degrees, associates, no college degree, high school, and less. The less educated, generally, the higher the correlation with the unemployment for that group. And that's just something to keep in mind. Generally, investment in education yields a return in the form of better earnings and also better chance of being employed. What are other reasons workers don't necessarily move from lower paying to higher paying jobs? They may be prevented in doing so. Workers may not be aware there are higher paying jobs that they could qualify for. They may not be able to get up and move to a location where better paying jobs exist. They may have family or friends in an area, or they may just not be able to afford moving. It's easier said than done a lot of times to pick up and move. Unions and other government restraints may also artificially reinforce wage differentials. And in spite of legislation to the contrary, there is still discrimination in the workforce. Women and minorities a lot of times can get lower wages. So we have that as well. So this is all stuff that we should be rectifying. Lack of job information, the internet has improved that. Geographic immobility is a fact of life. Not everybody can get up and move. Unions, in theory, are good, but once again, if they are preventing people from moving up or earning better pay or something like that, or government restraints, that could be a negative consequence. And obviously, discrimination is something we need to continuously work to stamp out of the workplace. What are some other reasons? You have the principal agent problem. I believe we covered this earlier in the class. That is, the interests of workers and firms aren't identical. So you may have situations where workers seek to increase their utility by working less than agreed upon. So to prevent this, many firms employ incentive pay, where worker compensation is tied to their output or performance. A piece rate is a situation where employees get compensated according to the number of units they make. The more they make, the more they get paid. A commission or royalty, most sales jobs utilize these. This ties your compensation to the value of sales. You generally have a base pay, and your base pay may just be the minimum wage, and then you can earn large commissions or royalties on whatever you sell, a percentage of your sales. You can also pay employees with things like bonuses, stock options, and profit sharing. A bonus every year depending on how well you work, and that could be variable. Stock options meaning you get the right to buy shares in the company generally a lot lower than they're worth, or you can even be gifted shares. And profit sharing, you get a piece of the company's profits. What are efficiency wages? Efficiency wages seek to enhance worker efficiency or encourage workers to work harder. But they can have negative side effects. Piece rates can just encourage employees to slap out things as fast as possible with no quality control, so rapid production at the expense of product quality. Commissions, bonuses, stock options, and profit-sharing plans can encourage unethical behavior, and this happens a lot among employees in order to increase their own income at the expense of the firm. Pharmaceutical companies have a big problem with this. There were situations where drug reps were getting commissions based on prescriptions being written by doctors, so they did all sorts of unethical things like encouraging doctors to write really strong addictive pain medication to people who probably didn't need it. They made a lot of money in commissions, but as a consequence it led to a massive epidemic of opioid addiction. So unethical behavior happens quite often when a lot of your pay is tied to commission. So ranging from that to things like really high pressure unethical sales techniques, or trapping customers into buying things they don't need, or far beyond what they wanted, or making them sign confusing contracts or anything like that, done with things like timeshares or various types of things in those industries. That's all tied to commissions. Insurance sales can often be like this, etc. So there are good and bad sides to pay for performance. And finally, occupational licensing, what we were looking at before. It makes sense for some fields, but you could argue certainly not others. So for things like doctors or EMTs or a pilot, obviously you want that professional to be licensed. You would not want to get into a plane with someone that you have no idea if they know how to fly it, or be operated on by a doctor who may not have gone to medical school. So having strict licenses for those types of fields is a no-brainer. What about someone who's an interior designer? Nearly 1 in 3 jobs today require a license, and a license is a barrier to entry. A lot of these are low-wage jobs like cosmetology, childcare, being a florist, a barber, bartending, tree trimming, bus driving, hair braiding, massage therapy, working for a travel agency. And these licenses can be unnecessarily limiting and also very expensive for poor workers to get. Instead of working as soon as their needed training on the job is completed, they may have to go through months or years of costly requirements, and their only purpose, those requirements, is to limit the competition for those who already have the licenses. So before they can start earning in the field, they may have to spend large amounts of money just simply getting the license. And this can be a major impediment to poor people hoping to set up their own businesses or switch careers. So you can certainly argue that all of this red tape is not necessarily good for a lot of lower wage jobs, and that we really should be doing something about this. So keep that in mind, and that's the last word for this chapter. And that's going to bring us to the end of our second to last chapter, chapter number 17.